Beaming in from downtown Adelaide on the edge of the beautiful parklands here. We've got a glorious morning for our forum. Not face-to-face today or in person, but in time to come, that will certainly be the plan. So welcome today, and thank you for joining us for our World Elder Abuse Awareness Day Forum. This year's theme for the forum is Perception versus Reality. ARIS has been holding this annual forum now for 17 years, and this is the 4th time that we've held it online. Next year, though, we will meet face-to-face, but I'll tell you more about that later. My name is Michelle Bentley, and I'll be your MC today. I've been with ARIS since 2017, and I'm currently the Deputy Chairperson of the ARIS Board. We will start with our welcome to country, and I welcome and have great pleasure to introduce Uncle Frank Wanganeen, who is a Kaurna elder born at Wallaroo on Narungga country. Welcome to Uncle Frank as you welcome us to country.
Thank you, Michelle. Yeah, it's really a pleasure to be here back at ARIS. And you know, so we've always been supportive of their work and what they do around, particularly around elder abuse and the work they do with Aboriginal people is really, I think is really excellent. So now I'll just do the Kaurna welcome in the Kaurna language. Nai Tampadi Tuwila Berkiana, Nai Tampadi Bambaba Urendi, Kaurna Yurtiana, Mardat Younger Kaurna Miuna, Nai Wangani Marni Nai Budni, Kaurna Yurtiana, Tarndan Younger, Wadliana. So what I just said in the Kaurna language is I just want to acknowledge our ancestors, also recognise where we all in this event is on Kaurna country. And on behalf of the Kaurna people, I welcome you here to Tarndan Younger, the place of the red kangaroo. So Nataya, thank you. Hope you have a great day. Nataya.
Thank you very much, Uncle Frank. So it is today that I welcome you. Apparently we have 824 registrations today, which is remarkable, really. The event has grown in its interest for people nationally, and that's an increase of about 200 registrations on last year. So thank you all for logging in and for your interest in this very important topic. Elder abuse, of course, is very much in the forefront of our minds, following on from the Royal Commission, and a lot more attention placed, I believe, to the rights of older people. Just one moment. It keeps going down. Thank you. I'm not sure what you may have heard some of that, but not actually seen some of that. So again, we have marvelous number of registrations, 824 today. Thank you for joining us. And thank you also for our 5 very specialist and generous panelists who are taking time from their busy schedule today to be part of this forum. Thank you to our sponsors for their support and commitment to this important event. Our champion sponsor is Kalara, and our supporter sponsors are Adelaide Primary Health Network, Rest Haven, Southern Cross Care. Before we get going into the formal parts of our presentation, I'll just go over a few housekeeping issues today, or matters to take into consideration. We're actually recording today's forum, and we will share a link with you after the event is complete. You're welcome to revisit the content and to share it also with your colleagues and networks. We also invite your questions, so please feel free to use the Q&A box on your screen if you have a question you'd like to address to a particular speaker at any point. We will try and address as many as we can following all the presentations. If there is a particular speaker you would like to reference your question to, please do so. We are tight for time, so it's likely we won't perhaps get to all of your questions, but please feel free that if we're not able to address those today, I encourage you to contact Aris. So let's get underway with a couple of polls just to find out where you're all based and also the sorts of organisations for whom you identify with. As I think that will provide a handy context for us all to know the breadth of attendees that we have today. So Sakina, if you can please put up the first poll on the screen. Thank you. Right, it looks like the poll is coming through very well. I can see there that we have great numbers, particularly and understandably in the aged care and community services provider group, in health and allied health professionals, government employees, advocates, community members, education. So that's fantastic. Thank you very much for registering that poll. And now, Sakina, if you can please pop up the next poll around location. Can see a few of you are still registering that poll, but the numbers are significant. Over 50% of interstate people have logged in today. Thank you very much. I hope your weather is as glorious as ours today in South Australia or in Adelaide. We've also got 34% in South Australia, in metropolitan, 7% in our rural and remote regions, and a lovely 1% of overseas attendees. So thank you very much for logging in from across the waters. That's terrific. So a really diverse group of attendees, terrific national presence here, which I think further cements our understanding of just what an important issue that this is, and that this forum is truly a national forum. So we look forward to you joining us next year in person if you can, but also logging in via means such as today. So our theme for today, for our 2023 WEAAD forum, is perception versus reality. So let's just be clear of our understanding of what we think is elder abuse. It can be defined as a single or repeated act or lack of appropriate action. It can occur within any relationship where there is an expectation of trust. It is that which causes harm or distress to an older person. And elder abuse can take various forms, such as physical, sexual, psychological, financial, and/or neglect. And in response to the recommendations from the Royal Commission into Aged Care Quality and Safety, there are now new reforms in the aged care sector. These reforms will place older people first, empowering them to make informed choices. Significant changes will lead to improved lived experiences, it's hoped, for older people, both in residential aged care and for those still living in their own homes. How these changes are implemented and actioned is the theme of this conference today, and that is perception versus reality. Reality is what people are experiencing. Perception is based on how older people view their experiences. Older people's perception may consider their experiences as not being that of elder abuse, as others might consider it. And that may be because they are in denial and they do not seek any support. According to the National Institute of Family Studies, in a 12-month period, 1 in 6 older people was experiencing some form of elder abuse by someone in a relationship of trust. This is the reality. But we can all do our part to improve the overall well-being of older Australians. The support of family, friends, community services can assist older people in retaining control of their lives, enhancing their well-being and helping them to maintain their independence at home. So this is what we're exploring today. And our special panelist group will bring various perspectives to our attention this morning. So just on that, I'll share with you, we need to just have a little disclaimer that any of the material or views expressed today are the views of the presenters and are not the views of ARIS. The material presented is also of a general nature, and you should seek professional advice for your individual circumstances. So that now leads us in the segue into our formal presentations. But firstly, we have, and I'm very pleased to say, a message from the Honourable Chris Picton, MP, South Australian Minister for Health and Wellbeing. So it's terrific to have Mr. Picton's endorsement in this important event, and we will now share with you a video from him. Thank you, Sakina.
Thank you very much for having me, and it's a delight to be part of the World Elder Abuse Awareness Day online forum once again. I'd like to thank the Age Rights Advocacy Service for again putting on this forum. I understand the 18th such forum. Particularly also I'd like to acknowledge that I'm meeting on the traditional lands of the Kaurna people today and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and also acknowledge traditional owners for everybody who will be watching this online forum today. Again, this is such an important issue for us to meet about. It's something where we acknowledge the theme of the forum today is about perception versus reality. And I think this is very true when it comes to elder abuse, that the perception often is that this applies to somebody else. It wouldn't apply to my family or my community, that this would happen somewhere else. The reality is that we know that it's very common, and the statistics show just how common it is in relation to the number of older people who will suffer some sort of abuse during their lifetime, whether that be emotional, physical, financial or other abuse. And that's why together as a community, we must stand together to say that abuse of elders is not acceptable, and we need to be tackling this in every part of our society. From our perspective in the state government, we're about to launch again a new campaign that will be running over the next few weeks, tackling this issue, highlighting the issue and promoting the positive role that older people play in South Australia, and really tacking on some of those stereotypes that unfortunately do exist. Also importantly about the work that we're doing is highlighting how people can report and raise issues of abuse when they come to light. And that's the important work that we do through the Office of Ageing Well, the Adult Safeguarding Unit, which provides that service for people to be able to make complaints and either to be looked into by that office or referred to other appropriate bodies as another avenue where those abuses can be raised and make sure that they're properly investigated and looked into. We've been undertaking work in relation to reviewing the role of the Adult Safeguarding Unit. We've had the South Australian Law Reform Institute publish a report which highlighted a number of ways that we can improve the scope of what the Adult Safeguarding Unit does. And we'll be bringing legislation to the Parliament to strengthen that very important unit and make sure that it has all the necessary legal powers it needs to make sure that it's another element where we can take on abuse in our community as well. We're also Of course, continuing that expanded scope of the role of the Adult Safeguarding Unit and making sure it's appropriately staffed to properly look into those complaints that are raised and make sure that they can be followed up as necessary. There's many other areas in which we do need to look at how we protect the rights of older people in South Australia. One of those areas as well that we're doing a lot of work on at the moment is in relation to retirement villages, which is an excellent way in which many South Australians choose to have their retirement in the lifestyle of one of those retirement villages in South Australia. But it's a critical area in which we need to make sure that rights of the people who live in those communities are respected. And so we've been undertaking a consultation around the state over the previous couple of months to hear from South Australians living in retirement villages about how we can improve the legislation. And once again, we'll be taking legislation to the Parliament to strengthen the role and the protections for people who are living in retirement villages. So once again, I'd like to really thank the Age Rights Advocacy Service for the role that you do, for helping individual South Australians and also playing an important role in advocating to government on changes that we can make to improve the policy settings and the laws to protect the rights of all older South Australians. I'd like to congratulate everyone in putting together this online forum again today and hope again that there can be another way of shining a spotlight on this very important issue and making sure that we can end the abuse of elders in South Australia.
And we thank Minister Picton for his contribution and starting our forum today, and of the importance in which the government sees this issue. So I'd now like to introduce the Chief Executive Officer of ARIS, Carol-Ann Barkla, and she will provide an overview of ARIS's work over the last 12 months. Thank you very much, Carol-Ann. Beg your pardon, Carol-Ann, I didn't really give you the formal introduction and just outline your background, so apologies for that. For those of you who perhaps don't know Carol-Ann's background, she has had 26 years experience or over that, initially as a registered nurse, also as a lawyer, an executive, spanning health, aged care, legal and not-for-profit peak bodies. She's been involved in policy, sector development and social justice. So thank you very much, Carol-Ann. She also serves on a number of not-for-profit boards and advisory committees. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Michelle. I'm just getting my slides up for me at the moment. So I would like to acknowledge the lands that I meet on today, the lands of the Kaurna people, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I also want to acknowledge all First Nations people on this conference today. So thanks so much. Hopefully my slides are about to come up. Oh, excellent. Next slide, please. Thank you. So a little bit about ARIS for people who are joining us for the first time online. And I understand that we have some people who have registered from overseas, so a big welcome to you as well. So ARIS has been supporting older people for over 32 years by providing advocacy, information and education support. ARIS is the only South Australian member of the Older Persons Advocacy Network. We are accredited under the ACES accreditation at a certificate level. And I just want to acknowledge our funders. Our funders are the Department of Health, the National Aged Care Advocacy Program, Older Persons Advocacy Network, Office for Ageing Well, SA Health and Wellbeing, and the Adelaide PHN. And I did want to just make a couple of comments around our service delivery. So next slide, please. So these are the different programs that we have across ARIS. We're able to assist older people and their family in regards to any issues related to residential and home care that is funded by the Commonwealth Government. We have an elder abuse prevention and response program, which assists older people who are experiencing abuse by family and friends and anyone in a trusted relationship. We have a retirement villages advocacy program that can assist older people who are experiencing issues with management or other issues in the retirement villages. We have a Care Finders program targeted to the City of Salisbury and City of Playford, and that program can assist finding aged care services for older people. We have a home care check-in program that assists older people who are really experiencing social isolation and really need to be linked back to the community. So have some additional supports to check in and make sure that they are able to access some social supports and have some additional supports to help them. Lastly, we have a financial specialist service which supports older people in regards to their financial issues that they may be experiencing in regards to their home care packages or residential fees and charges. So that's a bit of an overview. We, of course, have some other programs as well, which includes the First Nations intergenerational gathering, which is held in a different regional location each year. We also host this forum. And of course, we have Aboriginal advocates who deliver across our programs, ensuring that we have a culturally sensitive approach to supporting First Nations peoples. So next slide, please. So a bit of fast facts about what we did last financial year. And as you can appreciate, and I strongly encourage you to do, the financial year begins 1 July, and we're just about 2 weeks before the end. So I strongly encourage you to get along to our annual general meeting in November, and you'll get an update on what we've been doing for that financial year. But overall, we had 6,173 contacts from the public. We provided close to 3,000 episodes of information and advocacy support, over 344 education sessions delivered to 5,000, nearly 6,000 older people. We assisted 416 people to access My Aged Care. We supported 179 people to stay connected with their community. And we had 715 calls provided and referred to another service. And I just wanted to take the opportunity now to actually kind of say, the notion that really the perception and how important the education sessions are. So our theme is perception versus reality. It's quite often that myself and or the advocates are out doing education sessions face-to-face. And it is in once those education sessions are finished and we're quietly talking to older people or in a private place, and it's then that they will actually quietly disclose to you that what we've just talked about is happening to them. And they will actually quite often say, I never thought this would happen to me, and I never recognised this. And maybe this is happening just because I'm old. Isn't this what happens to older people? And quite frankly, it's heartbreaking. And it's so essential that we call out ageism. And it's absolutely essential that we need to continue to provide intervention services, but we also need to be really, really clear about prevention and social connection. It's so fundamental to having such a wonderful, purpose in life and that we can support all Australians, including older Australians, to live a wonderful life. Next slide, please. So this slide really reveals who we're working with and I'm talking about really when the older person is experiencing abuse. And you can see overwhelmingly that we're working with older person or maybe their supporter as well. But I also want to point out that we quite often work with aged care staff who will raise issues with us and concerns. And of course, we will then, of course, seek consent of the older person to then work together to resolve some of these issues. Next slide, please. So the types of abuse, and I don't think it's any surprise, they haven't changed since last year. And it's overwhelmingly psychological and emotional abuse. But once again, these frequently go hand in hand with financial abuse. It's really, really incredible, the numbers that are showing there. And I think it's overwhelmingly those kind of things. I think the other thing to point out is, of course, we've got misuse of powers of attorney coming in around 2.5%. And also we have, sexual assault, and OPAN and ARIS and the members of OPAN have been shining quite a light on the issues of sexual assault. And we've been doing this because it is overwhelmingly older people who are raising their concerns about these figures. Next slide, please. So this slide tells the story as well. Overwhelmingly, it is a daughter or a son. They're significant numbers. You're hitting 70% who is perpetrating the abuse. I will also point out, because in previous slides and previous presentations, people will always ask me about staff or volunteers. So you can see the staff and volunteers number is sitting around about 3%. So obviously more needs to be done. Next slide, please. So our stats tell us that we assisted 518 people, which interestingly enough accounts to being 1 in 6 of people who've sought our support at ARIS, which is a little bit coincidental given the numbers of 1 in 6 nationally for the Australian Institute of Family Studies number. So what do we know from our data? Risk factors for older people is family conflict, cognitive impairment, isolation, lack of information. So going back to a bit about that understanding that actually older people, just because you're old, you don't actually lose your rights, and you are entitled to be able to manage your financial affairs and other matters. Financial stress is coming into play here a little bit as well. So it will be interesting to see how things bear out over the next 12 months, given economic developments. So we work closely with other agencies, such as the Adult Safeguarding Unit that the Minister mentioned, the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission, the Office of the Public Advocate, the Public Trustee and Legal Services Commission to stop or prevent further abuse of older people. I just want to remind everyone that we only ever work with the consent of the older person, and they always will have choices in regards to that support, except if they're at serious risk of imminent harm. Next slide, please. So systemic advocacy over last financial years, Retirement Villages Act, as the Minister mentioned, Powers of Attorney Bill, restrictive practices, and we continue to work on some of these issues. Restrictive practices continues to be of concern. Guardianship and administration, and thinking about what is a modern approach to guardianship and administration. witness competence and evidence and how we can support more people to give evidence. Nationally, the aged care reforms continue to roll out and they're relentless, but we welcome those as much as possible. And we noted that Minister Wells recently released the roadmap for reforms. The National Register of Enduring Powers of Attorney continues to be something that we are very interested and advocating for. And of course, the Elder Abuse Action Australia Blueprint and National Shame. And of course, there's been much more that's happened since we closed off that last financial year. And I strongly encourage you to keep an eye on our next annual report and welcome the opportunity to share that information with you. Next slide, please. So I just want to bring attention to these 3 stories that are in our annual report. Graham's story on page 24 outlines financial abuse and misuse of powers of attorney whilst he's living in a residential aged care facility. And these things are real. These happen to people every day. And I strongly encourage you to take that opportunity to fully explore Graham's story. Sadie's story on page 26, alleged sexual assault by another resident in a residential care facility. These are complex issues and complex areas, but we do need to shine a light on them in order to be able to collectively respond and support best practice and support older people to feel safe. Cynthia's story on page 28. This is about guardianship and also about Section 32 powers that we were able to assist Cynthia to have revoked. And Cynthia now resides in a retirement village after she clearly articulated that she did not want to be in a residential care facility and sought assistance to actually remove those powers and move to where she wanted to be. So I strongly encourage you to read those stories. And I also strongly encourage you to continue to focus and shine the light on abuse of older people. Next slide, please. So we're expanding. Last time, I think I talked a little bit about our outlets in Newry and Victor Harbour. We are now in Berry. So we really, really are excited by that. And it's just wonderful to have that engagement at a local level in those communities. And so we welcome anyone who wishes to reach out and be connected. So next slide, please. So thank you. And you've got my contact details, and please send through any information and look forward to questions. Thanks, Michelle.
Thanks so much, Carol-Ann. Very informative, and certainly ARIS is a very busy organisation. In some ways, sadly to say that, because the issues are so prevalent out there in the community. And the fastbacks, I think, highlight just how much need there is out there. And yet I imagine we all understand and appreciate that there's a lot of unmet need too, and incidents of elder abuse of which go uncited and unseen and unreported. I think there's a lot of information there that would resonate with many of the attendees today that you've seen either in your professional experiences or in your personal life. And so to have so many of you attend today and to see the growth in interest about this very important topic is fantastic. It's a very complex industry with complex and changing legislation for the better, presumably, and certainly very increasing community and government focus on these issues. And I think, thank you, Carol-Ann, for pointing out in the annual report those personal stories, because I think It is the stories, the real life stories, that help bring what can sometimes, for some people, be distant issues much closer to home. So thank you for that presentation, Carol Ann. Now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you our keynote presenter, the Honourable Dr. Kay Patterson, AO, Age Discrimination Commissioner. Kay was appointed the Age Discrimination Commissioner in July of 2016, and Dr. Patterson is highly qualified in this role. Teaching psychology to health science students in the 1970s, she developed an interest in gerontology and expanded the undergraduate programs in human development to include the study of aging, and co-developed the first postgrad diploma in gerontology in Victoria. She was elected to the Senate in 1987 and pursued throughout her parliamentary career, both as a backbencher and cabinet minister, issues affecting older Australians. Older workers, elder abuse and homelessness have been her priorities in her current role. So it's with great pleasure we introduce Dr. Kay Patterson, who will speak to you this morning on Together We Can Make a Difference. Elder abuse has no place in our community. Thank you, Dr. Patterson.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. I hope the background's the right way around now. Is that right?
Yes.
It's Teams is the other way around. So I've had a terrible morning, I have to say. My blood pressure, I think, is 200 over 180. We set this all up on Tuesday. That was all right. Suddenly, I've had a change in my my IT, and I couldn't get anything this morning. So forgive me, I'm a little bit agitated because I've got it working now, but I'm speaking to you from the land of the Ngunnawal people in Canberra, the traditional owners of the lands from which I'm speaking, and I pay respect to their elders past, present and emerging. And to say that I'm delighted that there are so many people, but I'm shocked that I may have not even been able to get onto this presentation. So forgive me for my anxiety. I just want to say thank you to the Aged Care Rights Advocacy Service for inviting me to provide this keynote address. It's my last Elder Abuse Awareness Day week as Age Discrimination Commissioner. My 7-year term finishes on the 31st of July, but I'm still not going to let go of some of the issues I've been pursuing. And I just wanted to say that ARAS has been a great support to me, and I've been with you physically a number of times for this occasion. And maybe even next time I get back to Adelaide when you're having your next one next year when it's face-to-face. But I'm glad to be with you. I want to acknowledge the Minister for Health, the Honourable Chris Picton, and the other speakers, and all of you listening and advocating for people experiencing or at risk of elder abuse. As the Age Discrimination Commissioner, I've made it my priority during my term to address 3 major manifestations of age discrimination. People say to me, you know, what does your department do? My department's varied between 1.5 and 5 people over the 7 years. So I've had to cut my coat to fit my cloth, and I've chosen elder abuse in the community, older women's risk of homelessness, and age discrimination in the workplace. Now, I hold deep concerns and commitment about the issues in aged care, and has not been a central focus of my time as a commissioner. This was because the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission, which is responsible for protecting and enhancing safety, health and wellbeing of people receiving aged care services, that's people in aged care and people receiving aged care in the home. And for that last group, I'm particularly asking those of you who are continuing in this area and working in this area, that's where I think the greatest dangers can occur in elder abuse. We now have much more focus on elder abuse within aged care facilities, but there's oversight there. There are other staff, there are visitors, there are people who may blow the whistle that something's happening. But with aged care in the home, sometimes it may be a single carer, sometimes it may be carers coming in and out, but nobody there at the same time. We have to open our eyes and make sure that we don't have another Royal Commission in 15 years' time about abuse in aged care in the home. So it's an issue that I think we all have to keep focused on and our minds on. The federal government also funds the Older Persons Advocacy Network, and as ARAS knows, and OPAN has responsibility to advocate for older people in residential aged care and aged care in the home. And I've got a tremendous working relationship with their CEO, Craig Gear, and I know that they've done just so much more than was happening 8 or 10 years ago. Having said that, my team and I keep a close eye on the Aged Care Royal Commission recommendations, their implementation from a human rights perspective of person-centred care and issues around autonomy and independence. I think one of the things we've got to be careful of in aged care is that we don't actually control people so much in benevolent ageism in lots of ways and actually reduce their autonomy. I'm also a member of the Council of Elders, which was established by the Australian government to consult with senior Australians and provide advice about aged care reform and ageing generally. Even before my appointment as Age Discrimination Commissioner, I had a long interest in the rights of older persons. 50 years ago, I was studying child development, and one of my teachers, a brilliant pedagogue, showed us a video of children who'd been abused in a black and white. This takes me back ages. A black and white video of children who'd been abused, children who'd been put into hot water, children who'd had cigarette burns. And her colleagues, this is in the late 60s, her colleagues said that to us that she was an alarmist, it was ridiculous, that this didn't happen to children in Australia, it was only happened in America. You know what? I emceed the apology to the victims and survivors of child abuse, the very people who are being abused when those academics were saying that it wasn't happening in Australia. And we've seen how wrong they were. Now, elder abuse now isn't quite like that, but really for a very long time, it was hidden, people were ashamed, and it wasn't out in the open. And now it is, and we've got the opportunity to try and fight elder abuse and fight ageism in a way that we hadn't had before. But, it was the same with family abuse. It was a private affair. We shouldn't get into it. And that changed. And now it's time for abuse of older people to get the same recognition. It's now at the public stage of public awareness that child abuse was many, many years ago, and family violence was until a few years ago. The title of my speech, Together We Can Make a Difference, Breaking Perceptions About Elder Abuse. I'd just like to share some insights about ageist perceptions as a key driver of elder abuse, the key impacts and what we've been doing to address this, and some guidance on what actions we can all take to contribute to the community where older people are respected to be free of elder abuse. I want to make some comments about ageism. In 2021, the World Health Organization released the Global Report on Ageism. It contains, I think, one of the best definitions of ageism that I've seen. Ageism refers to the stereotypes, how we think, prejudice, how we feel, and discrimination, how we act, directed towards people on the basis of their age. Doesn't matter whether they're young or old, people can be just as ageist about young people. Ageism is an obstacle to the experience of ageing positively in a community which respects and supports the human rights of older people. It can also result in older people feeling they cannot exercise their rights and that their concerns are not being acknowledged and addressed. Now, ageism can be malevolent or benevolent. Families, health professionals, and institutions can overprotect and reduce an older person's autonomy, sometimes to the point of malevolent ageism, which can lead to ignoring the wishes and autonomy of older people and lead to their abuse and neglect. We are all acutely aware of these instances in the much publicised aged care cases and the ones that Carol Ann's just referred to that are in the annual report at ARIS. Elder abuse often starts with benevolent ageism, where attitudes tip the scales towards protection and away from respect for an older person's independence and right to make decisions. When taken to an extreme, these attitudes can result in elder abuse, leading to real harm to the older person, be it financial, physical, psychological, sexual, neglect, or a combination of these. Worryingly, the current cost of living pressures being experienced by many people in our community has the potential to exacerbate the risk of elder abuse. We all need to be vigilant against the likely increase in financial exploitation and inheritance impatience in the current economic environment. Ageism can also be two-way. People can be ageist, making assumptions and judgments about what someone can or cannot do based on their age. We can also have ageist views about ourselves, known as internalized ageism. This perception can have detrimental effects on our health and well-being. The domino effect is that because of their self-directed ageist thoughts, older people feel they cannot exercise their rights or speak out to report abuse. Individuals working in health and aged care services can reinforce and perpetuate ageism and discrimination based on age, often through unconscious bias. The Royal Commission into Aged Care, Quality and Safety undertook research into ageism, which included a survey and qualitative research into the relationship between ageism and attitudes towards older people in aged care. This research found prevalent negative descriptions of older people and include a perception that they are vulnerable, frail, slow, closed-minded, inflexible, lonely, scared and invisible. While many of the survey respondents had little exposure to older Australians and knew little about the aged care system, those who did interact with older people, either through family or community, predominantly described these interactions positively. Across all demographics and age groups surveyed, there was a clear preference expressed to remain living independently for as long as possible. When ageist attitudes are reflected in behaviour, this becomes age discrimination and may be demonstrated in the types of services available to older people, age-based assumptions about their preferences and capabilities, and language used when interacting with or talking about them. I'll just stop there for a moment because we've just finished an interesting project which we're launching on the 2nd of July or 4th of July, talking to people who interact with older people and doing some work with them and alerting them to their own ageism. And it's amazing what they said in their results. Things like, I didn't realise that it was demeaning to call someone sweetie or honey, and maybe it's best to ask them what they'd like to be called. And the results of just a 2.5 hour session raising people who face-to-face work with older people, raising their awareness about ageism, the results are stunning, and I'm looking forward to presenting them to you in July. Ageism is an insidious and pervasive factor in diminishing older people's human rights, and we need to be on the lookout for those signs in every context. What does a human rights approach provision service look like? If we take the example of aged care in my submission and subsequent appearance before the Aged Care Royal Commission prior to COVID, I noted the importance of the need for the Royal Commission to look at aged care through a human rights lens. And I'll just quote from my submission. We need much more than a tick-a-box approach. I suggested this was vital so that the care received by every Australian is not just good enough, but it's more than good enough. It's a fundamental human right that all people, regardless of their age, are treated humanely, with dignity and with respect for their autonomy. We can and should take this approach to all aspects of services and care that support older people to age positively. This means that the preferences and needs of older people must be the driving force behind the services they receive. Meeting the needs of older people, supporting their preferences and providing them with dignity of choice should be paramount. I came across an amazing story of a 100-year-old who returned home after recouping from a back injury. She had been in residential aged care for 2 years. This is an older person exercising her choice and her right to live independently in her own home and being supported to do so whilst maintaining her health and autonomy. And the example that Carol Ann referred to is exactly the same. She didn't want to be in residential aged care. She wanted to be in a retirement living service. So, you know, we need to make sure we listen carefully to the desires and wishes of older people. These are good examples of an older person's needs and preferences being followed and the care services wrapping around to support this outcome. The translation of a human rights-based approach into practice is helpfully informed by what's known as panel principles: participation, accountability, non-discrimination and equality, empowerment and legality. Participation requires older people to have free and meaningful participation in decisions being made about them and helping them to know their rights. Information must also be accessible and mechanisms put in place to enable participation. For example, I'm of the view that assessments used to determine an individual's decision-making capacity need research and refining to ensure they can differentiate the circumstances and domains in which a person does or does not have decision-making capacity. There should also be opportunities for reassessment of a person's decision-making capacity. I had a very dear friend who was in her 90s, had an acute psychotic episode, and I was her advocate. She was put into a psychiatric centre, and people looked at her very carefully and decided this was a reaction to a shingles treatment she'd had. And I wonder if she'd been put straight into aged care, whether she would have been medicated for her poor behaviour. And they were able to, the psychiatrists at the facility where she was were able to work with her. And nearly 2 months later, she came out and lived another 6 very, very happy years being able to make decisions for herself. That was a temporary thing that could have been seen as long-term. We have to be very careful. And I think I might not be able to make decisions about investing my superannuation fund, but I can make decisions possibly about who visits me or how I'm going to spend some of my money. So we must need to have a much finer assessment. And there's some people at Macquarie University working on that. Can we have an accurate, or as accurate as possible, assessment and make sure that it can change with time, either reverse or realise that you can't make some of the decisions you're able to make before. Accountability requires the development of appropriate policies, procedures and mechanisms to monitor how people's rights are being affected and provide remedy when things go wrong. Horrific accounts of abuse and neglect have come to light through the Royal Commission and unfortunately continue. The Commission estimated there were approximately 50 residents per week experiencing sexual, and 30.8% of residents living in aged care facilities have experienced neglect. This is wrong, and we must do everything we can to ensure such incidents do not happen again and perpetrators of these crimes are held to account. Non-discrimination and equality. Research indicates a strong link between ageism and greater risk to older people's physical and mental health, plus the quality of healthcare they receive. To just give you one example, a person in residential aged care was assumed by an aged care staff to have limited or declining faculties. An old woman who used to visit me in my Senate office, and she rang me, well, her niece contacted me, niece by marriage, and said, look, nothing's happening. She can't hear, she can't see the television, she can't answer the telephone. And I said to my audiologist, would you come out with me to visit her? She had all her marbles in her 96 and said to the management, I've got Kay Patterson coming to visit me with her audiologist. Look up on that thing you use, that computer, and find out what she does. The next day, an audiologist appeared to see her, and she had severely blocked ears from wax. That was corrected, and her hearing aids were working. There was an assumption that she had declining capacity and they weren't going to do anything about it. That should never happen. Ageism and unconscious bias can seep into behaviours of aged care workers and influence assumptions about residents' preferences and capabilities. This highlights the importance of addressing ageism, such as through education for staff and fostering intergenerational programs to counter ageist attitudes. The next issue in the program is empowerment. Older persons should be provided with information about their rights and how they can exercise their rights, including through advocacy or communication. One of the things I've seen was a facility where a mediation group wanted to go and talk to her. She had rung them for help, and the manager said, oh, her power of attorney says she can't have visitors. That's not the role of a power of attorney. And one of the problems was that here was a power being used. She wasn't able to access her rights to have someone come and visit and talk to her about possible mediation with her daughter. And finally, legality requires recognition of rights as legally enforceable and grounded in domestic and international law. It will be important for stakeholders to participate in law reform processes to ensure the rights are embedded in law and legally enforceable. The panel framework is one way to embed human rights, that is participation, accountability, non-discrimination, equality, and empowerment and legality. We can also learn from elsewhere in the world and drawing on other jurisdictions like Scotland, England, and Wales, which have implemented a human rights approach in the provision of health services. We can see that training has a vital role to play in applying a human rights approach in practice. For example, education and training for aged care decision makers service providers and all staff is essential on topics such as elder abuse, ageism, human rights, and understanding the scope and limitations of enduring documents. As I said, sometimes enduring documents can be inappropriately used to restrict who can visit an aged care resident. Media coverage of older people and elder abuse can also influence and result in ageist perceptions, and this is another big issue to tackle. Well, we've been advocating for the implementation of the recommendations of the Australian Law Reform Commission report, which was tabled 6 years ago yesterday. I've been advocating for all the Attorneys General to agree to harmonisation of enduring powers of attorney laws across jurisdictions, a national register enduring power of attorney and guardianship documents. Current inconsistencies across jurisdictions cause confusion in the community, make it difficult for families to understand the rules, and for experts to provide advice across jurisdictions. Harmonisation would make it easier for families to look after older family members in other jurisdictions, as well as to educate older people about their rights and attorneys about their responsibilities. I've also been encouraging the development of education materials and training for professionals in all sectors who work with older people. We've also undertaken several initiatives to raise awareness of ageism and break down perceptions. We released a report called What's Age Got to Do With It, which provided a snapshot of ageism across the Australian lifespan. And we followed this with a new project, as I said, evaluating the effectiveness of educational intervention in reshaping beliefs and perceptions about ageing and older people, among those working with older people in aged care and community sectors. To date, the teams have provided aged care training to over 300 aged care and community workers from across Australia. We've also created bookmarks in 20 languages, and they're available. You can just contact me through the Age Discrimination for the Australian Human Rights Commission. If you're going out to an organisation with, say, for example, older people from one of those 20 languages, you can take the bookmarks and hand them out. And there are also posters you can print off from our website. Also, we've got 1-800 Elder Help line, and that's 1-800-353-374. That directs phone calls to the state from which the person is called, and we've seen an increasing number of people using that and also using the state helplines. Last year, we launched a new elder abuse video campaign on radio called Shift Your Perspective. It was a third in a series to tackling elder abuse, and it was challenging to do that because it was encouraging perpetrators of abuse to think about how their actions might be affecting older people, and we had significant coverage in social media and across radio and television. We've also just yesterday released a project, Have You Thought About Later Life? It's a new education campaign in 6 different languages that urges older Australians from a range of culturally diverse backgrounds to safeguard themselves against elder abuse. We did a toe in the water piece of research and found that people from the CALD community knew about wills. They knew almost nothing about enduring documents or advanced care directives. And this is one way of starting to get the communities in the CALD community, at least 5 major communities, to think about planning ahead. And we've also, I've just had the privilege of being MC at the Centenarian Portrait Project by Teenagers 100 Canberra exhibition, opened at the Belconnen Arts Centre. It's 10 portraits done by teenagers from the 465 that we've done across Australia. And some of you will have been at the one in South Australia where we had, I think it was 70 teenagers painting 70 centenarians, and the stories that have come out of that have been wonderful. All the data shows that education and intergenerational projects are the best way of fighting ageism. So the most important thing for us all is to keep our eyes open, encourage people to have their planning documents. Of those of you online today, if you haven't got your enduring documents in place and your will in place, go and stick a notice on your fridge and do it. And the other thing I say to every group to whom I speak, that the culture we set now is the culture we'll inherit in the future. And thank you to all of you who are online today who are changing the culture. But if self-interest doesn't motivate some people, it should, because we will inherit the culture that we're setting now. Thank you for your interest.
Thank you, Dr. Kay Patterson. That was a wonderful presentation, and you captured a lot of very significant issues. It's with some sadness, of course, that this is your last WEAAD forum in this capacity. We'll miss you in this capacity, but of course you're very welcome to attend in person, online in future, and I'm sure that your involvement across all of these areas will continue, perhaps not in such a public forum, but no doubt will continue in great depth. And you've brought to our attention today a lot of very important issues and aspects of the things that we often witness, whether knowingly or unwittingly perhaps, and ageism, and talking of benevolent ageism, which is, I think, an interesting term and a very important one, but also internalized ageism. And just as a little aside, I work with a lot of people in assisting them in their career and in managing their careers or transitioning in their careers. And the number of people who have said to me, oh, I've turned 50 or I'm in my early 50s, you know, will I get a job? And so we often have self-limiting thoughts based on some perception about our age and what others might feel about that and what we feel about it ourselves. And I think we need to educate ourselves in that capacity too, and understand how we can influence the perception of others through our own behaviors and our own engagement in the world, you know, beyond our immediate orb. So thank you for that. I see unconscious bias regularly. Well, is it conscious, is it unconscious? Sometimes that's hard to know. And certainly your work across the industry and bringing all of these issues and those of human rights to other people through public forums, through education, through your resource development has been just fantastic. So we thank you for your significant contribution to this issue of older people and to other vulnerable people. Your wealth of knowledge, your drive and influence across all of these issues and raising community awareness is significant. So thank you very much for that.
And I'm not going to let attorneys general off. They've got to do something. To year 2000, it was put onto the Attorney General's agenda. Can you believe that?
Wow.
Organisation of powers of attorney. So I want you all to be talking to your attorneys general wherever you are, well, not the international people, but the state people, and get them moving on this issue.
And thank you to Dr. Patterson for your support of ARIS over all of these years. It's been fundamentally important to us to know that we've had your ear and your attention, and you ours as well. So thank you again for your presentation, and we look forward to seeing you at next year's forum.
Well, any excuse to come to Adelaide. I'll stay online to the end. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. And so that brings us now to our next presenter, Richard Brueggemann. And Richard is another familiar face and identity in this field. So thanks for joining us and taking some time from your day. Richard is a disability advocate and was the Chief Executive Officer of the Intellectual Disability Services Council from 1984 until 2006. Richard was named the Senior South Australia in 2021. And in 2013, he was appointed as South Australia's senior practitioner to reduce the use of restrictive practices in South Australia. In 2020, he was appointed as authorising officer under the COVID-19 Emergency Response Act of 2020 to consider the applications to detain people who lack capacity and whose actions were putting themselves or others at risk of infection. He was also appointed to the task force to investigate the systemic failures that contributed to the death of Anne Marie Smith. Certainly a case, I imagine, recognised by all attendees. Richard will speak to us this morning on remember Maslow and his hierarchy of needs, a motivational theory that I'm certainly well aware of, and a popular framework in considering prioritisation of needs. An oldie, but a goodie. Over to you, Richard.
Well, thank you very much for that very generous introduction. And I also want to recognise the Ghana people who were the original custodians of this beautiful place in which we're meeting. And just to say, doing better for our First Nations people is something that we have to do in whatever services we are providing. So I'm a serial revisionist, so you'll notice that the title of the forum has actually changed a bit. I've added a few other things. Next slide. In terms of the discussion that we're talking about, that is abuse, I'm of the view that there's things that we recognise pretty instantly as abuse, that is physical and sexual assault, being robbed, being these things are actually only the tip of the iceberg. And today I want to talk to you about some of the other forms of abuse, which include the unauthorised use of restrictive practices, being ignored, being prevented from participating and contributing, and being subjected to control and petty meannesses. Next slide, thanks. So I wanted to talk about restrictive practices. And these are basically any practice that removes a person's freedom of action or ability to take make a decision for themselves. And these were endemic in our disability services. And unfortunately, they're pretty prevalent in aged care services as well. Next slide. Next slide, thanks. So why should we take them seriously? And you can just run through these things. Firstly, because of Magna Carta, no free man, didn't say woman at the time, but of course includes women, can be seized or imprisoned without due process of law of the land. And those principles exist to today. No one can be deprived of their liberty unless there's a legal process to do it. The next one. Because restrictive practices are dangerous. An American study showed 142 people in a 10-year period being killed by the use of restrictive practices in disability and mental health services in America. Next slide. Because restrictive practices largely don't fix anything. They stop the individual from causing harm or harming themselves, but the use of the restrictive practice doesn't resolve the underlying issue which is causing the behaviour. And fourthly, the next slide, because the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission is going to take the use of restrictive practices very seriously. Next slide. So restrictive practices were so ingrained within our disability services that we even invented service-like language to describe them. So locking someone in their room was no longer false imprisonment, which it would be for you or I, were we locked in a place where we didn't want to be locked. It was time out. And in my view, any time a person is prevented from exercising agency over their own lives is essentially an abusive, restrictive practice. Oh, I've managed to lose my slides. I want to just give you a few examples of these. I had another thing here. So, right, we're just, these technical issues, we're okay. I wasn't even seeing the whole screen. Good, thanks. Next slide. So I've given some examples of people who've been subject to restrictive practices in aged care. Donald, and I won't read, you can read these yourselves. I don't want to read them through necessarily, but here's a man basically wants to do things and he's prevented from doing it just by not helping him do the things that he wants to do because this guy is in a wheelchair and can't move. Next slide. Meredith, who is well known to me in aged care, she with mild dementia, and when she went into the nursing home, she was anxious, confused, non-compliant. She was prescribed diazepam, and that caused her to be basically comatose. And you'd go and visit her, and she would say, oh, lovely to see you. And 3 minutes later, I think you should go, and back to sleep. She spent most of her time asleep. She was chemically restrained. Next slide. But her daughter and I met with the new CEO of the service that she lived in. And this person said, my staff don't know anything about dementia. Well, you know, I thought that's a large part of their business. And she was reviewed by a geriatrician who stopped the diazepam. So here's a woman who you'd have to wake her up when you went to see her. And then within 3 minutes, she wanted you to go. And the next time I came to see her, as soon as I came into the room, she said, did you watch the ABC program on money laundering? Do you think X and Y, some of our mutual friends, are into that? It was a different person. She'd essentially been written off. And indeed, her daughter was told by the doctor who prescribed the diazepam that she'd probably be dead within a year. And now that's over 2 years ago. And I asked the question, this doctor who's provided by the aged care service, for whom was he working? For Meredith to treat a condition that needed diazepam, or for the organisation who needed diazepam to basically control her behaviour? Next slide, please. And poor old Anton, a pastry cook and baker, who's now living in a nursing home. He wants to access the kitchen so he can no doubt talk about baking things and cooking things and perhaps tell people all the things that he used to do. It's on a different floor. The staff have been told not to let him access the lift and not to help him use the keypad. And so instead of him going down and getting some satisfaction from talking to the staff, he's now basically being confined to his room. And his ability to talk to people, to meet some of those higher order needs that Maslow talks about, have been eroded because, make up the excuse that you want. Food safety was the one that they used in this particular case. So these are things that we really need to address in aged care services. Next slide, thanks. So in South Australia, there's a little group of us who are looking at trying to get the state government to legislate, to regulate the use of restrictive practices as they have done in respect to people with disabilities who are funded through the NDIS. This is currently with the State Attorney General, and there needs to be, in many instances, eyes outside of the organisation looking at these decisions, saying, is this really necessary? Is this something that needs to occur to keep the person safe? Or is this for the convenience of the organisation? And if it's the latter, then it shouldn't be happening. Next slide, thanks. Now, I've been thinking about my own journey into aged care, which my doctor told me doesn't start till 85, which I'm very pleased for. But I'm just thinking about when I go into a residential service and I discover that breakfast won't be oat bran, blueberries, yogurt, and a banana eaten at 6:15 in the morning like it has been for the last 20 years. It'll be whatever they choose to serve me at the time that they want to serve me. And I might get stroppy. And when I notice that I have to ring a bell to be taken to the toilet, I might feel a sense of lost dignity and hurt. And when I realize that all of these activities that I used to be in charge of myself are in the control of people that I don't know, I might start to get a bit angsty to basically take some control and agency over my life. And when you refuse the medication that you're offered, you refuse to get dressed, you withdraw to your room, you become irritable, you swear at staff, I'll probably be labelled as problematic, and I'll probably be zapped with some medication like diazepam. Next slide. So here's Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And it's well known at the bottom of the basic needs, our need for food, water, safety, our psychological needs, the need to belong, and the self-actualization skills, the ones where we feel fulfilled in life, the things that we got through our jobs, through the work that we did in our community. And the next slide, please. And how important those things were to us. And just reflect on the program that we all saw on television a few years ago, the Old People's Home for 4-year-olds, where a group of young 4-year-old kids interacted with a group of residents in a nursing home, most of them frail, immobile, depressed. And the interactions between them were so uplifting that it was quite a dramatic program in itself. However, there were measurable improvements in the physical and mental well-being of all of those participants. And I asked the question, why was this so exceptional that it rated a TV series? And what's being done to ensure that this is the norm and that other higher order needs are being met in our aged care citizens? Next slide, thanks. So in my work in disability services, I was doing training on restrictive practices, and I asked staff to choose between two nasty options. I talked about it in terms of Sophie's choice. And I said to them, here are your two options. 3 times a year, you get a slap across the face. It'll sting, won't leave any marks, won't do any damage. Or alternatively, every day of your life, you'll be perpetually bored, dependent on others, not supported to gain skills or exercise personal decision-making. And when I stopped doing my training, the score was 1,880 people went with the slaps, 4 people went with the second option. And it made me think, what do we report to the NDIS Quality and Safeguards Commission? We report the slaps. We don't report the fact that people have got boring, pointless lives where they're losing skills, where they're losing their capacity to live lives like other people. And I asked the question, doesn't the Commission get it? And unfortunately, I think the answer is no. I've probably got into a lot of trouble for saying that. Next slide, thanks. So our daughter-in-law is a psychologist in a New York nursing home. All new admissions to that nursing home are referred for a psychological evaluation to see how they're going to cope in that new environment. Next slide, thanks. And this has been really beneficial for people. They understand that they'll be grappling with a whole host of things, a loss of independence, financial, social, housing, a whole array of interpersonal issues. And psychologists get referrals from within the organisation, and they determine the root causes of common behaviours and provide practical recommendations that ultimately improve the experience of those patients. Next slide, thanks. And the results have been really outstanding. They deal with such things as pain management, sleep, hygiene, mood regulation, and their presence has resulted in fewer hospital admissions, reduced use of psychotropic medication, better plan development and compliance, and better educated and skilled staff. Just imagine if we think of some of the staff we might have interacted with within aged care services, not having the benefit of those skills that they might gain from interacting with someone like a psychologist. Next slide, thanks. One of the other things that I think that we might look at in the aged care sector are community visitors. These have been well established in disability services. People who go into a service, observe and ask questions and report their findings to a principal community visitor. Interestingly, during the pandemic, during that legislation about the need for new restrictive practices in aged care and disability services where people might not be compliant, community visitors had a role in aged care. And I think that it's something that we should really be looking at, the way in which another set of eyes are there to have a look at what's occurring in these organisations. Next slide, thanks. I asked the question, who are the really big abusers? And I've been contemplating recently what I've called systems abuse, where our institutions have been set up in such a way that we don't deal with the things that sort of trip the triggers and get you reported to the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission or the NDIS Quality and Safeguards Commission, because you don't want to be investigated by those. But the things that don't get there, the boring lives, the dependence, the lack of skills, the lack of staff who are interested, those things don't raise a blip on the radar of the regulators. And who's responsible for that? Well, ministers, CEOs, managers. And in my view, they're a part of this process of abuse through their indifference, lack of interest, awareness, courage, and or a sense of accountability. And I think, for example, in the NDIS Quality and Safeguards Commission, part of the title is quality. And what's the commission done to ensure quality of services? Not a great deal, I'm afraid. And I think that's the very thing where we should be starting our examination of what's occurring in our services. Next slide, thanks. So the other thing that concerns me, and I've called this Richard's cranky theory, unlike our last speaker, a lot of this is personal views, untested by research. But one of the things that I've been reflecting on is that since the dawn of time, our lives have been a balance between struggle and comfort. Sometimes it's been more struggle than comfort, and getting the balance right in a way determines a good life. And our aged care systems and services push people towards comfort and dependence. So at the present time, I've got a contract with my neighbour's lad. I've got a box gutter, which in the box gutter season, May, June, drives me mad. Up on a ladder, which of course is forbidden now for me. And I've got a deal with my neighbour's lad, a certain amount of money. He keeps my box gutters clean. And it's been a really nice two-way process because he's been doing this for me. And he's a young lad who lacks a bit of confidence. So I've been able to reinforce what a good job he's doing and how I really appreciate that and giving him some confidence in his life. Now, I'm eligible for an aged care package eventually, and I've got my package. And you're encouraged, you don't have to, but there are not many people that do it. You're encouraged to sort of basically get an organisation to do this for you. So they won't employ my neighbour's son. They'll employ somebody who will be paid a lot more money than I'm paying him. And I lose not only that little bit of independence about choosing what I'm going to do, but in a way, I start to lose some of my connection with community, with my neighbours. And I can't help but think that that's the beginning of a process whereby our independence is eroded and we are starting the journey towards dependence. And as Voltaire wrote, It is not inequality that is the great misfortune, it is dependence. And being dependent is, for me, the greatest abuse that I can contemplate. Next slide, or is that it? That's it. Well, thank you very much. I don't know that I've taken all the time that I should have, but there we are.
Richard, thank you. No, you've covered the time well. And we certainly do appreciate your experience and your knowledge that you have brought to the group today, and your understanding of restrictive practices. And interesting to see there about the principles of the Magna Carta. Of course, the real life stories of Donald, Meredith and Anton do illustrate how sometimes it seems to be some of the simplest things that people would like and seem fair requests that are denied, that can be so affronting and a form of abuse, perhaps. And you mentioned too the 2017 show of Old People's Home for 4-year-olds. I loved that show. I watched it whenever I could, and then a subsequent program was brought out with older people and teenagers, and that too just highlighted the value that Dr. Kay Patterson also brought to us about the value of intergenerational relationships. And there are some people who have that due to the structure of their families and the way they manage their collective lives. But there are others who certainly are separated from intergenerational relationships. And I think that is a great sadness and a great loss. You talked of the psychological assessments in the New York nursing home, and I found that very interesting. I wonder how that is funded, whether by the nursing home or through government support in some way. But certainly very interesting results, and something I think for us to reflect upon of what might be some other strategies we could introduce to better understand residents moving into care of that kind. Community visitors, systems abusers, and the balance of struggle and comfort. And, you know, there are certainly human beings whose personality can draw them more towards comfort than discomfort. And I think that can happen at all phases of one's age, not just in older age. But the struggle between that and the potential loss perhaps of independence and separation through a life of comfort where our independence is restricted. So really terrific thoughts and ideas and issues that you've brought to our life using the framework of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So thank you very much, Richard, and we look forward to your continued support for ARIS and for this forum in future years. So that now brings us to just to acknowledge, which I think is important, our champion sponsors for this forum, Kalara. They've been a good supporter for the forum and for this particular, and for ARIS in general. So I'd just like to introduce Sarah Blunt, the Chief Executive Officer for Kalara, who will just speak to us a little bit about their organisation. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you very much. I just want to check that you can hear me all right, because I just had a little bit of trouble. I think I might have logged on twice, so I don't want an echo.
I can hear you well, thank you.
So I'd just like to acknowledge the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains, which is where I'm speaking from, and also Minister Picton and Dr. Kay Patterson. And Kalara is a sponsor, as we really highly value the work of ARIS here in South Australia. We have services across all of the areas that ARIS supports, so care, accommodation and in-home. And as a South Australian provider of services, and having been at the national table during COVID when I was chair of AXA, I'm really proud of the way we work together here in South Australia with our focus on older people across state government, the Office for Ageing Well, ARIS and providers, and everyone and the consumers and everyone who's involved. Because I think here in South Australia, we do that really well. Now, ageism is a root cause for so much of the human rights abuse that we see, from the downright criminal through to the subtle misunderstandings and stereotypes that simply make people's life miserable. And your work at ARIS really helps to tackle this and shine a light on it. At the ARIS AGM last year, Dr. Patterson said that an intergenerational focus is important to really change from the longer term, for the longer term. And that comment, I have to say, as a provider, had a really big impact on me. So we co-located a Montessori middle school in our aged care redevelopment at Morfett Vale, and we were really inspired too by the ABC programs, and that redevelopment completed in July 2020. So that had turned from an exciting intergenerational innovation to a massive risk, because if you remember, in July 2020, children under the age of 16 were locked out of aged care facilities on the grounds they were a COVID risk. And Dr. Patterson's comment last year really stimulated me to take action again, to get intergenerational programs really going again, because so much was lost during COVID. And as chair of the South Australian Innovation Hub, which is a community of practice of providers working together, we've lodged a grant through the ARIA program to work together to build more sustainable intergenerational programs in future. So fingers crossed for that. And we recently had a really lovely intergenerational week here, and our Montessori middle school children and the residents really led the charge on that. So that was great. So thank you, Dr. Patterson, for inspiring us and lifting our eyes up again post-COVID, and in the thick of all of these administrative reforms that we're working through. And thank you all at ARIS, the Office for Ageing, and everybody else online, because if you're online today, you're clearly interested in contributing to building better lives for older people in future and taking human rights really seriously. So thank you very much. That's all from me.
Thanks very much, Sarah. And thank you too for sharing that exciting program there of that intergenerational. I can imagine there's a lot of joy shared on either side. So terrific, and I'm glad that COVID is not intervening in that program so much these days. So thank you very much for sharing that with us. I'd also like to share some exciting news regarding ARIS and the Elder Abuse Action Australia are partnering to deliver in 2024, next year, Australian Elder Abuse Conference here in South Australia. The theme for the conference is Turn Up the Volume, and the conference will be held on the 22nd to the 24th of July next year, so you might like to note that in your diaries in advance. And it will be held at the Convention Centre, and it'll be a fully hybrid conference, so certainly cater for people to attend in person, but also for those who are not able to, they can log in online. So that will be a very exciting event, and we're looking for a lot of engagement from the community and nationally. We encourage all visitors to attend, and it would be lovely to see you all face to face. We also have the conference as co-host, and we expect to welcome over about 500 delegates in person. So if you can join us, note that down. And there's actually a pre-end of year financial review sale. So if you'd like to get your tickets early, and this is certainly very early, you can save up to $150 on a per person delegate. So full conference registration will be $905, but you can save $150 of that. That's about 17% by registering by only the 30th June this year. So please look us up on the website to register early and gain that saving. And the website is https://conference.eaaa.org.au/for more information. So those pre-sale tickets are available now and will finish on the 30th of June, and then you can register as normal. So our next speaker for today is one of the actual staff members of ARIS, an Aboriginal advocate, Julie Caridas. Julie is a proud Kumiluro. Apologies if I didn't get that quite right. Please, Julie, you can confirm that for us. From New South Wales originally. We're pleased to have her here now in Adelaide, and she has over 25 years of experience. Julie has worked extensively in the aged care and disability sectors. Julie possesses a wealth of life experience, having cared for her aging grandparents, living with dementia, and also a young grandson living with a disability. Her primary passion lies in supporting her mob to access quality and culturally safe services, as well as combating elder abuse within their communities. Julie will speak to us this morning on humbugging, what it is, and when does it cross the line from cultural obligation to elder abuse, and hence perception versus reality. Thank you, Julie.
Thank you so much, Michelle, for that introduction. And it's actually pronounced Gamilaroi, but good try. So Nina Mani, everyone. I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from Ghana land. Nina Mani is welcome in Ghana. And I pay my respects to elders, Ghana elders, and any other elders that are meeting with us today at the WEAAD conference from various lands. So as Michelle said, my presentation today is on humbugging, cultural obligation versus elder abuse, and that really fits in well with the perception versus reality theme of today's WEAAD. Firstly, I'd like to also advise that this presentation may contain images of First Nations people that may have passed. And I also would like to acknowledge the Kimberley Community Legal Services for their No More Humbug report, which we've taken some of the information and a short video clip courtesy of Kimberley Community Legal Services kindly let us use that. And please feel free to add any comments or questions in the chat or Q&A as we're going along, and we'll try to get to them if possible. So what is humbugging? Humbugging is an Aboriginal term. It's been around for a long time, and it's used in communities to describe a constant nagging, I suppose, for money, cigarettes, a place to stay, other resources, food, it could be the mobile phone, the car, and with no intentions of ever paying that money back, or sometimes, not contributing to, rent and food and things like that. Next slide, please, Sakina. So some of the different examples of humbugging. Money is probably the most common one, and it may just be small amounts, but it could be on a regular basis. So every pension day, the elder is humbugged by family for, small amounts of money, but this can accumulate into a large sum, which then leaves the older person quite vulnerable. Usually it's done by, children or grandchildren, but it can be other members of the family as well. And they will come around on pension day. They know when it's pension day, and they'll have their hand out for either money or, as I said, it could be to borrow the car. Quite often they'll take, they could take the car and, bring it back on empty, destroy it, dump it somewhere, leaving again the older person vulnerable without any means of transport. Another resource that's quite often taken by family is the older person's phone. I had an example the other day where I tried to ring a client and someone else answered the phone and they said, "Oh no, Arnie's given me her phone." So if they do take the phone, they may keep it, or they may use all the credit. And then again, because the older person may not have the finances to put more credit on the phone, they're being left isolated again. Food is a big one as well. Quite often an older person may have extended family come to stay. They might be travelling down from the APY lands or from other remote areas. They don't have food, so they eat, all the older person's food and then, don't contribute to the replenishment of the food. This again can cause the older person to be at risk of neglect, can cause, sickness and other complications, have other impacts. Medication's another resource that's quite often humbugged for or just taken without permission. This can be, to use themselves, or it could be to sell, for, possibly drug or alcohol. They may have a drug or alcohol addiction. Also, most Aboriginal people, and this is only my own experience, live in public housing or rental accommodation, and having people, coming and rocking up, and it could be a large number of people rock up, or, lack of finances to pay to keep on top of their rent, could mean that the older person's then at risk of homelessness. Next slide, please, Sabina. So humbugging is a national-wide issue. It's not just happening in Aboriginal culture. It does happen across most cultures, but it is far more prevalent, I believe, in Aboriginal communities. And this could be the fact that a lot of Aboriginal communities, mass numbers, live in rural and remote areas. And so where, there are fewer services that are available or resources, so then humbugging becomes a bigger issue. Next slide, please, Sabina. So some of the risk factors that are around humbugging is that dependency on others, and that can be, as I said, again, due to lack of culturally appropriate services. We know here in South Australia there are not a lot of aged care services that are Aboriginal specific, so a lot of older people do depend highly on their family for their aged care needs. Some Aboriginal elders are living with significant disabilities. This could be stroke or acquired brain injury due to, physical abuse. Poor physical health. A lot of Aboriginal people, and it's quite a high percentage, are diabetic or are receiving dialysis treatment, and a lot higher percentage than non-Indigenous people. Some Aboriginal people, elders, are also do have mental disorders such as depression. This could be the fact that they are not able to live on country or be on country, and this can cause a person to be quite depressed. The low income and socio-economic status, again, this, could be due to the fact that they live in remote areas where there's less jobs available. A lot of Aboriginal elders haven't completed school or haven't been to school at all, so it does, lend to that low ability to get a high paid job. Cognitive impairment and social isolation. So a high percentage of Aboriginal people are at risk of earlier onset dementia at a younger age, and a higher percentage due to genetics. So dementia is probably times more likely to have, an Aboriginal person is 3 times more likely to have dementia than a non-Aboriginal person. Grandparents looking after grandchildren. So there is a large number of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander grandparents looking after multiple grandchildren, and these can range from a young baby up into late teens. Some are looking after up to 5 to 10 children without any extra financial support or any support like services, extra support for grandparents that are looking after grandchildren. And sometimes it's even great grandchildren. So, and this is happening quite a lot, and probably it is getting worse. As I said, a lot of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people live in public housing or rented accommodation, or they could be living alone with a person that is financially abusing them or neglect. And so the evidence that women are more at risk of elder abuse than men, and this is possibly due to the cultural obligation of older Aboriginal women to be there for their family and to look after family. And so this would lend to women probably being at more risk. Few of government agencies, well, so due to historical trauma, a lot of Aboriginal elders especially are quite fearful when, you know, of government agencies, and this is around obviously some trauma from being part of the stolen generation. Also, there's a fear that DCP may become involved and take their grandchildren away. So quite often they won't engage with services from government agencies just because of those historical fears. The drug and alcohol problems in Aboriginal communities is quite significant, and this does lend to a lot more humbugging for money for drugs and alcohol. Also, the lack of awareness of rights and entitlements. As I said, a large number of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people live in remote communities, so they don't always get the information that they are entitled to around their rights, and that's something that ARIS is working towards remedying. Next slide, please, Sakina. So why does humbugging happen? So it's culture. I mean, that's the excuse. It's been that way for years, and actually they don't even realise that it is abuse. Alcohol and substance addictions, as I said, that feeds into not being able to, you know, hold down a job. And so then they are looking to the elders for financial support. Family obligation, sense of entitlement, you know, but we're family, so you need to help me. This is heard a lot in our communities. Unemployment, still, again, that is around the lack of work, possibly due to being in a remote community where opportunities for work are limited. And a very high percentage of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are on government benefits. The cost of living in remote. So recently our operations manager was in APY lands and went into the supermarket, and just for a very small tray of meat was $90. So the cost of living in remote communities is exorbitant. It's probably more than 4 times higher the price than, you know, compared to what you'd pay for in the city. And this is not just food. This is appliances, very, very few options for fruit and vegetables. Yeah, everything's frozen. So the cost of living and the fact that, you know, people are paying so much for food is also contributing to elders being humbugged. And the lack of services. So especially in the remote and regional and remote communities, we don't have as many charitable services in these communities, such as Salvo's Food Bank, where people can tap into those if they do find that they need some support around, you know, extra funding, food, clothing. So having that lack of services in those remote communities also does put elders at risk of being humbugged by family. Next slide, please. So as Carol Ann pointed out in her presentation, the common perpetrators are adult children and grandchildren, and in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families, it can be extended to nieces, nephews, cousins, uncles, aunties, because this in our culture, they are family, they are part of your immediate family, and so they can also be the perpetrators. Next slide, please. So why don't elders report it? So the cultural obligation to support family and share resources. This is a very strong culture that has been around for many, many years, dating back to traditional times where everything was shared. A lot of times the elders don't even realise that they're being abused, and quite often I think the perpetrators don't realise that they are actually abusing their elders. There's also a reluctance to report the abuse, and this is due to not wanting to get family in trouble. Also, it could be that the adult children may have spent some time in prison, and the elder is worried that they might end up going back to prison, so they don't want to report it. There's also the feeling of shame in the community. They don't want to report family because then they think that'll bring shame on them and their family. Poor money management skills and low literacy, financial literacy skills. As I said, this is probably can be due to lack of schooling. Many elders didn't attend school at all or didn't finish school, and that makes it quite hard when it comes to understanding bills and managing their money. And they quite often have a lot of different payments coming out, and they also get advances in payments to help family out. So this then ends up being a bill that they need to repay back to Centrelink. Sometimes it could be that they're being physically threatened by family to hand over money. But again, they don't like to report this because they feel that it will bring shame on them. And it is part of that expectation, I suppose, the cultural expectation that it's their financial responsibility to care for family. And sometimes it can be a whole family rock up and, and stay for several months with an older person without contributing, so that they, very reluctant to turf them out. Next slide, please, Sabina. So there's been a lot of talk over the previous presentations, which were fantastic, around the importance of intergenerational collaboration. So ARIS has played a big part in that. We've been holding intergenerational gatherings for Aboriginal elders and young people since 2012. So we've been doing it for over 10 years. And we do this because we want to bring the Aboriginal elders and youth in a particular area together to get to know each other, to talk about elder abuse and ageism, and also to talk about how do we put some safeguards in, how do we support each other, how do the elders support the youth and vice versa to look out for each other and safeguard each other. And we like to say that we're producing ambassadors for change in our young people so that they can spread the word around their community and around through their peers that we have to look after our elders and we need to respect them and, treat them with dignity and respect that they deserve. So, and also the other way around too, the elders, it's good for young people, for elders to see young people's side of the story as well. We also do education sessions and we're trying to get out to as many communities as possible. And we talk to them about that staying in control, planning ahead, doing your advanced care directive, having payments taken out so that your rent's paid and certain things are paid, electricity and stuff like that. And we also work very collaboratively with other agencies such as the ASU, and also just talking to aged care facilities about some of the safeguards that they can put in place to safeguard the elder, like rationing cash and and tobacco and things like that, so that when families do come, they don't take persons all of their resources. Next slide, please. So this is just a photo from one of our recent intergenerational gatherings that you might not be able to see, but on all the beanies it has respect. So that was our key word. And yeah, this is just one of the comments that one of the attendees had, that there was that building trust between elders and young people. And actually the elders met up with the young kids from Clontarf, which was the foundation program from Port Lincoln High School, and come up and had a yarn, and the students said, the elders said that never happened before. So there was already that new building of relationships. Right, getting a bit of a wind up here. So next slide, please. So this is a resource that ARIS has recently put out, and we've got it in a magnet or an A3 poster. It's had a great response. Heaps of service providers have said that, you know, giving this out, it's just highlighting some of those things in language that Aboriginal people can really relate to. And we're hoping that by reading this, elders will be able to go, hang on a minute, that's happening to me. Or even their children, their adult children, saying, wow, I did not realise that this was abuse. So if anyone wants to order any of these, there is the ARIS email there on the slide, and you can order it through us. So next slide, thanks, Akina. I think this is the clip, No More Humbug, and this is courtesy of the Kimberley Community Legal Services. Thank you.
We're just waiting there for the clip video. Are you able to share that with us?
My grandmother was our main carer and always looked after us. She did everything for us. But when I got older, I started hanging around people who were drinking and smoking ganja a lot, and then I needed money for those things too. I didn't have money because I didn't have a job.
Juro, help me with my banking. How you use this machine? I only use a bank book.
Auntie, can I have money for smokes? I'll pay you back next week. True, Auntie?
Hey, John, give me price. I'm broke. We all broke at camp. But we get our money tomorrow. I'll give you back, John. True.
Hey, Gran, can I have some money for Tucker? I just want money for takeaway.
I've got no tucker left and I'm hungry now. Big more people living at my camp, but I have to pay all the bills. I have no money left until next money day.
On pension day, we went looking for Gran, but we couldn't find her. I feel no good now. Our Gran got sick from eating old food.
Yeah, because you keep taking all her money. You are the main one asking for grog and ganja money, Joro.
Yeah, I know. We should be looking after her, not taking money from her all the time. Sorry, Gran, that I took your money. I know it's not right. We should be looking after you the way you looked after us when we was kids.
I like sharing with my family. That's what my old people did for me. We always share everything. Don't humbug me too much for my money.
I'm glad you came to your senses, Juro.
As a whole community, we have to make sure that we look after our elders, don't humbug them.
Humbugging is happening in our communities everywhere. We need to work together to stop this from happening to our old people and start respecting them by taking care of them.
So what are you doing for your elders in your community? How are you helping them today? Don't forget the good things our elders have done for us. Now it's our turn to look after them.
Thank you so much, Julie, for bringing that important topic of humbugging to our attentions, and certainly the issues around it and the prevalence and the strength of those cultural norms. I can imagine that that will be really quite a challenge to manage and to have, I guess, some change in terms of the expectations that the generations have of one another, but of those cultural obligations towards family and a reluctance to report due to perhaps perceptions of shame or responsibility to family members. So a significant issue, and certainly I'm very much more aware of that. So thank you, Julie, for bringing that to us. And now we have our last presentation for today. We have Dr. Sylvia Vilios, the Associate Professor at the Adelaide University Law School. She's co-director of the Regulation of Commercial Corporations, Insolvency and Taxation, based at the University of Adelaide, and also co-presenting Divya Narayan, researcher, SA Law and Reform Institute, also from the University of Adelaide. So a little bit about each of them presenting today. Dr. Vilios is closely involved with the work and consultation of the South Australian Law Reform Institute, where she has developed considerable expertise in carrying out major projects which have been directed at influencing social innovation, law reform, and public policy. She's a lead author of 3 recent major reports on succession law, enduring powers of attorney, and forfeiture. And Divya has graduated from the University of Adelaide in 2021 with a Bachelor of Laws and Bachelor of Arts. She worked with the South Australian Law Reform Institute in 2021 as the lead researcher on the report on adult safeguarding laws and assisted in writing the report for the Mental Health Act review. Divya currently works as a solicitor at Norman Waterhouse Lawyers across the employment and native title team. So together they will present on elder abuse, enduring powers of attorney, and the review of Adult Safeguarding Act. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that lovely introduction, Michelle. And thank you also to Julie for her presentation on humbugging. And I think that after hearing that presentation, there's a lot of similarity between what Julie said and what we found in our reference that I'll be speaking to today. So I'll speak first on the enduring powers of attorney reference, and then Divya will speak to adult safeguarding. So good afternoon, everyone. And my presentation today relates to the South Australian Law Reform Institute, which is known as SAORI, their reference into the role and operation of enduring powers of attorney in South Australia. And SAORI's reference involved investigating whether the current laws that apply to enduring powers of attorney, known as EPAs, in South Australia are effective and are working as intended. A report, of which I was the lead author, makes a total of 120 recommendations for changes to the law and practice to clarify and improve the use and operation of EPAs in South Australia. So to begin with, you may not be familiar with what an EPA or enduring power of attorney is. And EPAs allow individuals to plan for their future by identifying clear legal arrangements for their financial affairs, which will take effect at the point that they lose their ability to make those financial decisions themselves. So an EPA gives authority to a person known as the attorney, to make financial decisions for another person, known as the principal, when they can no longer make those decisions. So they enable principals to choose to appoint a trusted person called an attorney before they lose their decision-making capacity. So they provide a way for individuals to be able to control their financial future. And it's important to note that EPAs can only be related to financial matters, and they can't be used to make lifestyle choices or medical decisions, and that an advanced care directive is the document that you then enter into for that. However, it is often the case that making a financial decision can have lifestyle or medical effect. So an example is to pay for a nursing home or for medical costs. And another really important point to address when we're talking about EPAs is that of capacity, because an EPA only becomes effective once the principal loses their decision-making capacity. And it's only at this point in time that the attorney can then act as a principal, step in and then make those financial decisions for them. So in terms of legal capacity and what it is in the context of an EPA, it means that the person is no longer capable of making financial decisions for themselves. And this type of an assessment is different to what may take place in other legal contexts or in a medical setting. So a lack of capacity to make financial decisions does not mean that someone's unable to care for themselves or unable to use money. It means that they're unable to understand the nature and consequences of their decisions relating to their finances. And capacity can have significant human rights implications if persons' freedom is wrongly deprived because they've been considered to have lacked capacity, even though this wasn't the case. And sometimes it can be hard to know if someone has capacity because their capacity may be fluctuating. So a person with dementia may have periods where they're lucid and that they have capacity, but then this is followed by periods of incapacity where they're then unable to make financial decisions. And it's also important to note that just because you might disagree with a person's decisions about the way that they're using their money, this doesn't mean that that person lacks capacity. If they're able to understand the consequences of their decisions, then they still have capacity. Another important point to note concerning EPAs is that around what is the role and responsibilities of an attorney. And the person appointed to manage the financial affairs of the principal is called an attorney. And they're required to perform their duties with reasonable diligence, and they're supposed to protect the interests of the principal. But unfortunately, within our South Australian law, there's very little guidance about this. An attorney will make financial decisions for the principal in the event that they can't do so for themselves. So it's important that the principal chooses someone who they trust and provide them with guidance about their wishes and preferences when creating a power of attorney. And if there's not a trusted person in that principal's life, then a public trustee can also be appointed to take on that role, but then they will charge a fee for taking on that role. If an attorney doesn't act in the best interests of the person who's appointed them, they may be responsible for any loss that's incurred by that person. And this may occur if they deliberately fail to exercise reasonable diligence in their decision-making. A major theme in Sowry's reference, which is why I was invited to come and present today, is that around abuses of enduring powers of attorney. And as I said earlier, there are absolutely many benefits of entering into an EPA. It's a very important expression of autonomy, and it's also a valuable and convenient legal instrument, which many in the community can use to protect their financial and property interests in the event that in the future they lose their cognitive ability. However, a number of concerns were expressed to the South Australian Law Reform Institute, both by legal practitioners as well as members of the community, about the role and operation of EPAs and, in particular, the financial exploitation of older South Australians. And a consistent theme in our reference and it's consistent with research elsewhere, is the incidence of the abuse and misuse of EPAs. And whilst they were originally designed with good intentions in mind, instances do arise where the principal lacks decision-making capacity and the attorney abuses their role to receive an early inheritance, or they might otherwise misuse the principal's funds. We were presented with powerful case studies during our consultation, where we heard from parties over the concern of misuse of EPAs. Some of the cases were on the minor scale, and then there were other cases of abuse that were more sophisticated and extensive. Some were due to confusion and misunderstanding on the part of the attorney of their duties and a misguided sense of entitlement, and others were more calculated and deliberately deceitful. Common examples that we heard of were the draining of bank accounts or the transferring of a family home into the attorney's own name, which was at the more extreme end. And the unfortunate thing is that in most of these cases, the principal doesn't have the ability to monitor the attorney's actions. And even if they do, it's highly unlikely that they're going to then go on to report the abuse, given their position of vulnerability. The principal is often going to be socially isolated and highly dependent on those around them, but the effect of this financial abuse on them can be permanent and often life-threatening. There was also concern as to the lack of accessible and effective civil and criminal remedies to respond to these cases of abuse. And whilst there are various civil and criminal remedies that exist to deal with the misuse of EPAs, in practice, they prove to be quite ineffective. So it's often the case that the victim has died before the abuse ever comes to light. And it's only when you get to the stage of working out the assets for the purpose of distribution under a will that then it comes to light. Or alternatively, the victim may be unwilling or unable to testify, or unable or unwilling to make or pursue any complaint. And formal civil action can be very costly and time consuming. And the problem with relying on criminal law is that the police may not wish to get involved, as they see it as being a purely civil matter. So there are a number of practical measures that can be taken to prevent abuse before it happens, and things that you can do to try to safeguard against the risk of abuse is to create more community awareness around the roles of EPAs. Another mechanism could be to ensure that the principal and the attorney have both signed the EPA with full knowledge of their rights and their obligations. Another is to ensure that the EPA enables a statement of wishes, which are incorporated into the EPA document, where the principal sets out their wishes with respect to how they'd like their financial affairs to be managed at the point that they lose their decision-making capacity, and it will cover things like the payment of medical treatments. And also for the principal to provide copies of the EPA to others, including financial institutions and legal representatives. The law report, Sowry's report, found that the current safeguards in place are not adequate. And in our report, we made a number of additional recommendations for reform. And those recommendations are aimed at providing additional safeguards from abuse by an attorney under an EPA. And a few of our key recommendations in this regard were that, one, we should think about introducing a compulsory EPA register, which would provide greater checks and balances, and also it would prevent an attorney acting under a revoked enduring power of attorney. Another was that the Enduring Power of Attorney Act should contain a statement of objects and general principles, and that these principles should highlight the need for, as far as practicable, a supported decision-making approach rather than a substituted decision-making approach, that the roles, powers and responsibilities of an attorney should be clearly set out in any updated act, and that in terms of the form that's used, that there should be an updated prescribed form, and that it should include tick boxes of possible limits on the power of attorney. So under our current enduring power of attorney document, when you see the conditions panel, it's generally left blank, which gives the attorney the broadest possible power to then essentially step in for that person and make any financial decision that that person would otherwise have been able to make for themselves. So this tick box on the form would then turn the principal's mind to the fact that they can actually limit the types of decisions that can be made by the attorney for them in the event that they lose capacity, or there can be checks and balances incorporated within those conditions. And also that on the form itself, that the attorney acknowledge that they understand their role and responsibilities, and that they be provided with some form of education, including through some form of information booklet which accompanies the prescribed form. Another recommendation made by the Institute was that witnesses take more of an active role in certifying that the principal signed that EPA document voluntarily in the witness's presence, and that the principal appears to generally understand the nature and effect of that document. And also that at the point that the EPA is activated for the first time, that a medical practitioner must undertake the assessment that determines that that person lacks the ability to be able to make financial decisions for themselves. So under South Australia's current law, there's no requirement that a medical practitioner make that assessment. And in fact, the attorney themselves can make the assessment. So that's an important additional safeguard that I think should be incorporated, or Sowry believed should be incorporated in the law. And finally, there were a number of recommendations made with respect to who should actually be able to act as an attorney. It should be someone who's over the age of 18. It should be someone who has capacity themselves. A witness to the EPA should not be an attorney. Someone who's a professional care provider should not take on that role. Someone who's bankrupt or personally insolvent should not be acting as an attorney. There's no current restriction on that. A person convicted of certain offences involving domestic violence or dishonesty should also be either not able to act in that role, or at the very least, the principal should be informed that that person has a criminal record, and they should be able to give informed consent to them acting in that role in that case. And finally, under our current law, in order to seek a civil remedy, the principal or another party has to make an action and take it to the Supreme Court. And Sowry recommended that in order to reduce cost and make the system more accessible, where there are suspected cases of abuse, that there should be a civil remedy which allows you to go through the SACAT, which is our state-based tribunal, in order to pursue that. And I guess from our point of view, in preparing these recommendations, it was really important to make recommendations that would prevent the misuse or abuse of enduring powers of attorney, but then at the same time, not make it so restrictive that it would prevent people entering into these documents, which if entered into for the right purpose, and if the attorney does do the right thing, which in the majority of cases you'd hope they would, then they can be an very effective advanced care planning tool for an individual. So that's where we landed on enduring powers, and that's a high-level summary. And I'll now hand over to Divya, who will speak to our reference on adult safeguarding.
Hello, everyone. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. So I will be talking about our Sowry's reference into the Ageing and Adult Safeguarding Act in relation to adult safeguarding laws. And just before I start, I would also like to acknowledge that I'm coming from Ghana country, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and future. So as part of our Sowry's review into adult safeguarding laws, We were asked by the Minister of Health to consider to what extent this Act was achieving its purpose and potential improvements that could be made to the operation of the Act. We were also asked to review the functions and operations of two agencies established under this Act, being the Office for Ageing Well and the Adult Safeguarding Unit, which I'm sure are familiar names to many of you. During our consultation process for the report, we considered the input of service providers in the current adult safeguarding landscape, as well as various legal practitioners, medical practitioners, community groups, and experts in the elder abuse field. We additionally made efforts to consult with regional and Aboriginal communities during our visits in Port Augusta, Port Pirie, Naracoorte, Mount Gambier, Berry, and Whyalla. Through our consultation process, we received 68 written and oral submissions and 182 responses to a consultation survey, which helped us to understand how the Act operated in practice and potential changes to law and practice. For those of you who have potentially never heard of the Ageing and Adult Safeguarding Act, which is a South Australian piece of legislation, or the two bodies established under it, I'll provide a brief outline. The Office for Ageing Well, as many of you would know, is responsible for a diverse range of functions, but are aimed towards assisting older people to remain active and engaged within the community. In comparison to the Adult Safeguarding Unit, or the ASU, the Office for Ageing Well's remit is focused solely towards older people, whereas the ASU was intended to cover all adults. The ASU was established in 2018 by this Act and commenced operation in 2019. And quite incredibly, it was the first body of its kind in Australia. The ASU's intended function is to receive reports of suspected abuse or neglect, to coordinate a multi-agency response, and focus on early intervention, case coordination, and information sharing. The ASU was established during a time where elder abuse issues were quite prominent in media and academic discussions. And when the ASU was first established, it was intended to only apply to older people for the first 3 years of its operation and then extend to all people in South Australia. During our report, there were 3 key areas that I thought really fit into the theme today of perceptions versus reality in the elder abuse space. So I'll cover these briefly. The first was to do with the types of abuse that the ASU was intended to cover and capture. During our consultation, we found that one of the types of abuse that was not so often talked about, or something that I certainly had never encountered, was this idea of social abuse. I'm sure many of us have heard of the other types of abuse, such as financial abuse, which Sylvia covered, as well as physical abuse, sexual abuse, and neglect. Social abuse, however, relates to the detrimental effects of isolation on a person. And in our report, we recommended that social abuse be included as one of the forms of abuse that persons should be protected from. We define social abuse as the intentional prevention from having social contact with family or friends or accessing social activities. And during our consultation, we uncovered that social abuse arises in instances where persons may stop the older person from having contact with family or friends, withhold mail, prevent them from using their phone or other communication devices, or even prevent a person from engaging in religious or cultural practices. So it can be quite detrimental to the mental health of an older person or persons generally. And we felt that it should be covered as a type of abuse that the Adult Safeguarding Unit should be able to investigate. One of the other key takeaways from the report in terms of abuse was the prevalence and implications of psychological abuse, but specifically this term called gaslighting. Gaslighting is a form of coercion and psychological abuse that takes place over a prolonged period of time and consists of small, seemingly insignificant actions or conversations that lead to a reduced sense of autonomy in a person, causing them to question their own beliefs and actions, and potentially their own capabilities and sense of worth. For instance, an older person can be manipulated by someone to accept that if they're elderly, that they're a burden and they should be made to pay their way. The financial abuse that we uncovered was also quite prominent in the adult safeguarding landscape. And especially there was an interesting intersection between financial abuse and psychological abuse when it came to older persons. For instance, an example we were given during consultation was that an adult child might convince their older parent that they should no longer drive, even if they're still capable, and perhaps in serious circumstances convince them that they don't need their car or their house, and then ultimately sell or obtain these assets for their personal gain, to the detriment of this person. In our report, we also made recommendations to narrow the definition of abuse to more appropriately capture serious instances of abuse that are not captured by other laws in South Australia. Our consultation revealed that serious forms of elder abuse involve some level of trust, dependency, or imbalance of power. The relationship between a victim and an abuser needs to meet one of these criteria. For instance, an older person can rely on and fall into a relationship of dependency for services or day-to-day assistance, but they may not necessarily be in a relationship of trust. So in our report, we didn't recommend that trust, dependency, or imbalance of power all need to be there in order for a person to be able to access these safeguarding services, but rather one of these needs to be present. The second really interesting thing we uncovered during the report that I'm sure has been discussed throughout this presentation and the wider conference is the social perception towards older people and the prevalence of ageism even today. One of the comments I heard repeatedly during consultation, especially with community members and NGOs who work in the elder abuse space, was a crucial need to address ageist attitudes and simplistic stereotypes of older people. As we progressed through our consultation, it became clear that our society today, or more accurately, Western society that we live in, does not foster an environment where older people are celebrated and respected. Instead, what we heard all too common was that older people were viewed as frail and out of touch, perhaps not being able to actively contribute to society, and all too often viewed as a burden. Calls to remedy ageism has been echoed for many years and continues to be brought to our attention during this report as well. The final thing I'll cover is the issue of autonomy, which, as we know, is a significant and quite a big topic to tackle. The issue that we grappled with, arguably the most during our report, was how much should the Adult Safeguarding Unit intervene in a situation where there is suspected abuse. The Aging and Adult Safeguarding Act itself reflects human rights principles which have been propounded by the UN. And the Act places a strong focus on supported decision-making and respecting an individual's autonomy. It was recognised that the safeguarding mechanism in the ASU should be distinguished from a child protection system and should recognise that an adult has the right and ability to make decisions for themselves, presuming that they have capacity. For this reason, the Act enables a person who is suspected of being abused to decline the assistance of the ASU at any time. One thing that we heard frequently during our consultation is that older people deserve the right to make bad decisions. In fact, the European Court of Human Rights has noted that the ability to conduct one's life in a manner of one's own choosing may also include the opportunity to pursue activities perceived to be of a physically or morally harmful or dangerous nature for the individual concerned. Let's consider this in the context of the Adult Safeguarding Unit. In the case, which we have heard quite often during our consultation, where a grandparent is getting financially extorted or blackmailed to provide certain supports or perform certain acts, also they can see their grandchildren. For instance, an adult child might say, if you don't give me $1,000 a week, I don't know if I'll have the supports necessary to let you see the grandchildren. And in this instance, the grandparent might know exactly what is going on, but they might think to themselves, well, what do I need with all this money anyway? I'd rather see my grandchildren. And that is their decision. And in this situation, perhaps the ASU need not intervene. But consider a situation where there's a more imminent threat, where an adult child is about to sell the house of their older parent or move them into a nursing home against their wish. At this point, the older person will be effectively homeless or thrust into a nursing home without their consent. Should the ASU take an active role in this situation to step in? And the crucial situation here is, how is that decision made? Should there be certain criteria, or is it more of a feeling? One thing that we did find, however, is that Abuse itself undermines the dignity and autonomy of an older person. And in some instances, intervention by a safeguarding body, even in these serious circumstances where it can be difficult to ascertain whether it's appropriate to intervene or not, the intervention may restore the confidence of that older person in their own decision-making and autonomy, especially in instances where there has been gaslighting or other forms of abuse that have impacted the mental health and confidence of that older person. The conclusion that we came to in our report to the ASU is that the ASU should be able to act in situations of serious financial or physical abuse without the individual's consent. Our recommendation was that this serious financial abuse should be referenced to the outcome of the abuse and the apparent victim, in that it will result in a substantial adverse impact on the individual who may be vulnerable to abuse. And this should be determined on a case-by-case basis. Some of the scenarios that we posited was the risk of homelessness, being moved into a residential aged care facility against the wishes of the apparent victim, selling or transferring assets, including a home, against the wishes of an apparent victim, or withholding money or preventing access to a person's own funds, as well as the misuse of powers of attorney, which Sylvia has previously discussed. So that is a brief summary of some of what I felt were the key issues that arose from our review into adult safeguarding laws in South Australia, and specifically the Ageing and Adult Safeguarding Act. And if anyone is curious to know any more, this report, as well as the powers of attorney report Sylvia talked about, can be found on Salary's website. Thank you for having me, and that is the end of my talk.
Thank you very much, Sylvia and Divya. Very informative and very complex, certainly enduring powers of attorney, EPA, particularly around the determination of someone's capacity to make decisions around financial decisions. And of course, even with a legal framework in place and an instrument such as an EPA, it's still not immune from the possibilities of abuse. So it's rather an irony that we set up legal frameworks to help protect people, but there are ways that people can still use their powers to find someone's vulnerability. And adult safeguarding and social abuse, gaslighting, financial, psychological abuse that comes through that, and ultimately, across all of the realms of misuse of power. So thank you so much for your joint presentation. That now brings us to some questions, and thank you for everyone who sent in questions during the forum today, and also some people sent in some questions prior to the day. Due to the volume and the time that we have available, and we're looking to finish at 1:45 SA time, so some of you, your tummies are probably gurgling away, waiting for lunch. We're just going to keep just one question to the panelists each. And so if you can just keep your responses to a couple of minutes only. Some of the questions, though, are worthy of much lengthier response, but we just don't have the time. For the questions that have been brought to our attention that we can't address through this forum, you will receive a response from Aris or perhaps from the presenter today. But please just take in mind too, it may be a response with brevity and not really answer your breadth of question. But if I can begin with you, Kay, a question that was submitted prior to the forum. How is language being reshaped around older Australians?
Well, thank you very much. And thank you to the other presenters. I've enjoyed listening to it. I wish we could have more of these more often because it's so educative. I don't know, the language has changed. Ageism is still rife. If we had sorts of jokes, oh, you look good for your age, we don't say that to someone, you look good for being an Indian or you look good for being a woman. It's strange that we accept ageist comments quite willingly when we don't actually even make those sort of comments to a person of colour or a woman versus a man. I mean, so I think we've got to change a lot of the language because, as we said and you repeated again, that you can take on all these ageist things to yourself. Well, I shouldn't be doing that. Maybe I'm too old to do that, because people have this ageist attitude towards us. So I think it's absolutely important that we pull ourselves up when we're actually making ageist comments. And some of the birthday cards are revolting. You know, I've become more aware of looking at birthday cards, and I don't send ones that joke about, oh, I hope you remember it's your birthday. I mean, they're terrible things. You don't write a thing saying, I hope you remember that you're a daughter, or I hope you, it's just, go and have a look at the cards and you'll think, oh dear me, they really are very ageist. So I think it's about pulling ourselves up, pulling others up, calling it out when we see it. But I'm not sure that it's changed all that much. I think that's something we've got to work on, because it affects not only the way we treat older people, but the way we treat ourselves. So it's really important that we make sure that we aren't ageist. And you know, about young people, all young people are on their mobiles. You know, they never listen. They don't worry about their finances. That's just as ageist as saying all old people, you know, are mean, or they're lazy, or they're frail. You know, I just think we've got to be very careful. We just accept everyone as they are, as individuals, not being defined by their age.
Thank you. Yes, I think we've got a lot of work to be done in that area. Now, Richard, how are you going to go with this question? How do you empower seniors? You're on mute, I think, Richard.
I've just been unmuted.
Thank you.
And that's given me 1.2 seconds to think about. Look, I think the first thing we have to do is raise our expectations about older people. You know, people with disabilities have been subjected to low expectations, and that's what's exactly happened. They've sort of lowered their game to meet those expectations. When we've raised the expectations of people with disabilities, and I've worked particularly with people with intellectual disabilities, the things that they've done have been incredible. And I can't help but think that the same thing permeates our system for older people, and that we should have expectations that these are people who are citizens, who have capacity, who can do things, and that we should be changing our government, our sort of political settings to encourage people to achieve the things that they're capable of achieving. The thing that concerns me at the present time is that many of these settings are about, you know, well, let somebody else take this over from you, and you know, pay somebody 45% of your care package to basically provide a B grade service. You know, I believe having higher expectations of what people can do, and then having the settings that enable them to do that, would be one way of empowering people.
Yes, thank you for that, Richard. And a former teacher, and often seeing some young people having low expectations, that the power of the self-fulfilling prophecy of the expectations that we have of others, but also that we have of ourselves, and they're not mutually exclusive. One impacts on the other. So yes, I think looking at the expectations that we have of others, but also of ourselves, and how can we raise the bar on that? So thank you. Carol Ann, an interesting question here. What do I do if I find my aged care provider is sending me inflated monthly statements, leaving me with less money in my account?
Thank you for asking that question. Thanks, Michelle. Simple. 1-800-700-600. We have specialist financial advocates. They are qualified, you know, accountants and have financial backgrounds, and so they will be able to assist you.
Yes, so certainly I think if a family member is aware of that, reach out and get some professional guidance. Thank you. And Julie, can you share with us in what ways are organisations working to prevent humbugging? And obviously in the Kimberleys, they've been working on it. Are you able to share some other thoughts on that?
Yeah, sure, Michelle. So in my experience providing education sessions in some of our rural and remote areas, some of the providers are safeguarding the elders by having that discussion with them around humbugging, knowing that family are, coming to visit, especially in an aged care facility on a pension day and, putting their hand out for money. So having a discussion with the older person about what they want to do, and in a lot of cases, they don't want to hand over all their money. So they will help the elder to ration. Okay, so what are you comfortable to give family? And it could be the same with, tobacco rations or things like that as well. So they're working with the older person to still meet that cultural obligation to support family, but also safeguarding themselves and not leaving themselves with nothing. So we see that happening in some of those remote aged care facilities. Also, just raising awareness by, displaying our posters and our magnets, asking those questions about, is any of these things happening to you? And if it is, then, maybe referring them to ARIS if they want to have some advocacy support. I think in some extreme cases, there has been a need for a provider to apply to SACAT for a guardianship order, just to safeguard that person if it's quite serious financial or psychological abuse. So, that's some of the safeguards that some of the organisations are putting in place as well.
Great. Thanks, Julie. And the last question for them this morning to Sylvia and Divya: should the accountability around powers of attorney and guardianship be reviewed? Much elder abuse seems to take place under these legal authorities.
Absolutely, Michelle, and I think that that's probably more targeted to me than Divya, but I think that's my presentation was about the South Australian Law Reform Institute's recent review. And I think you made an excellent point about, we've got this legal framework, so you should be able to achieve what the intention is. But unfortunately, I think the law can only go so far. So hopefully we will see those recommendations, come into a bill, which will then become an act, and there'll be some additional safeguards that are implemented as part of that. But I think, and it comes back to the other presentations that I've heard today, that it comes more to the practical side as to whether we can actually achieve the end of abuse of EPAs. And I think that we need to become a society where there's not this culture of entitlement. So that will involve change, but then also the move from a substitute decision-making approach to a supported decision-making approach to empower that person to retain their decision-making capacity for as long as possible. And, if there is fluctuating capacity, or there can be a support put in place by the attorney rather than just stepping into the shoes of the principal, if they can support the principal to help them to make these financial decisions, to empower them for as long as possible, I think that's really important. So the practical side's more important than the law reform.
Great. Thank you, Sylvia. Thank you so much to all of our panelists. Enormous wealth of knowledge shared between you. And we welcome any feedback that you can pass on to us regarding our forum. But I feel privileged to have been able to listen to all the presentations and contributions, and for us to be able to share that to a much broader community. And I think, the title for today's series of presentations, Perceptions and Reality, was very apt. And I just have written down a few key words and related to our knowledge, experience and interpretations around dependency, autonomy and independence, imbalance or balance of powers, cultural norms and family norms and expectations, biases, ageism, abuse. And I guess, if you boil all that down about how we understand a relationship of trust and what are the elements of that trust, what makes up a relationship of trust and what erodes it. And clearly the issues we've been talking about are the issues that have been eroding trust in relationships. And so I guess it will be a lifelong quest for all of us to, just chip away to reduce that erosion of trust between people and to lead to healthy and fulfilled lives for older people and for all people. So thank you so much for your contributions. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank Caroline, Doris, Carolina and Sakina here at ARIS, who've allowed this to go on technologically pretty well. Yes, thank you, Kay. I know it was a bit of a nightmare of a start for you, but we've all got through it, hopefully pretty unscathed. And also, I'm not sure if Uncle Frank is still within the building here, but to thank his welcome the country as well. It's been a valuable time, I feel. I hope you recognise the value. It's looking like the feedback is very positive, so thank you for that. And we welcome you next year, face-to-face or online, for our forum. And I bid you farewell to a happy and healthy year ahead, and to an enjoyable Friday afternoon and weekend. Thank you so much to all our panelists. Goodbye.